Hey, Culpeper Presbyterian family. This is another follow-up Friday video. This last Sunday, we talked about the spiritual habit or routine of remembering. One of the great disjunctures between contemporary American Christian spiritual practice and that which you see in the Bible has to do with remembering. Very much like lamenting that we talked about a couple of weeks ago. It's odd that in American Christianity, we are very much about worship and Bible study and prayer and service, but we forget this obvious theme that really runs from the first page of the Bible to the end of it. Over and over again, we are told to remember. Remembering is important for any number of reasons, some of which we talked about on Sunday. I'm going to give you two more. Carl Jung, the famous psychologist, said, and this is a paraphrase, if we don't remember, then we are doomed to repeat our own past. What he means by that is if you don't take time to review and reflect upon and recall what's going on in your life, then you become your own dubious victim. You just repeat the cycles of your own habitual behavior, reactions, feelings, and thoughts. And it is through active remembering, according to Jung, that we are able to identify the rhythms and routines of our past and therefore break them or keep them if they're good ones that we want to keep. Also, what you'll find is that the more you practice active remembering, the more you're going to feel like you are aware of your own life. That you are no longer, as the psychologists call it, living vaguely, as if you were a stone skipping across the surface of your own life. The way for you to find meaning and depth is for you to pause and to look backward at your life, even if only the last 24 hours or the last few days, and to remember it, to chew on it, and to digest it. There was an old Orthodox priest who told a young Orthodox priest that the key to the spiritual life is that you need to be all eye, just like the cherubim of heaven. What he means by that is you need to live your life attentively, paying attention to what's actually happening in it, what your experience of it was, how you felt about it, where you encountered God in it. And the only way to do that is through active remembering. Two of the spiritual disciplines or habits that we talked about on Sunday that involve memory or remembering are, number one, journaling, and number two, the Old Testament practice of memory stones, or what are sometimes called the stones of remembrance. If both of those subjects that we talked about on Sunday are intriguing to you, in this email there are links to an article apiece on each of those subjects. So you can read a little bit more and consider a little bit more about what might be a new practice that you might want to weave into your own spiritual life. What I promised you on Sunday is that I would do this video, and in part, I would talk to you about how I have, in my own spiritual life, used active remembering and how powerful it has been for me. So first, about journaling. I really didn't take up journaling until sometime in my late 30s. I attempted before, especially early on in my 20s and my early 30s. And what I found is that I treated my journal like a diary, and I got frustrated because I didn't want to sit down and write for 30 minutes or an hour. And I didn't want to put that much attention or that much detail into it. I didn't want to feel like I was writing a paper or another sermon. So it took me a while to figure out what worked. And for me, what works is what's called bullet journaling. I talked about this a little bit on Sunday. So, with regularity, what I have done for the last 15 or so years of my life is that I've kept a bullet journal. Here is my current one. And they've all taken different shapes and sizes. This one's just pretty small, and I can carry it around with me. And what I will do in this bullet journal is every few days I sit down with a set of questions, often the examine questions that I sent you on Monday, and I will review the last few days of my life. And I will just write single phrases, single sentences, at most a paragraph or two, answering each one of those questions, highlighting where I saw God, where I was grateful, where I cooperated with God, where I did not, and so forth. And the neat thing is, I've been doing this long enough now that I now can go backward and read through the bulk of my life for the last 15 years. And even now, if there's something I forgot, I can reference backward to that time in my life, and I can find it in my bullet spiritual journals. So, for example, I've kept one while I was your interim pastor. And years later, if I want to come back and reflect upon the experience that I had here and the lessons that I learned here and the observations I made here, I would be able to do that. And this is my life much more fully lived because I am paying attention to it. I can now speak with great clarity and certainty about God's presence in my life simply because I pause a few times a week and I spend 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, sometimes during my fixed hour prayer, and I just remember. I reflect upon my life and I remember. Now, the other thing I wanted to share with you is some of my own memory stones. And my family and I, this is a practice we picked up early on. In fact, Heather and I can distinctly remember where it is we first heard this concept taught. And it was within the first 2 years of us being married at a church in Tucson, Arizona. And we were transfixed by the idea and have really practiced it ever since. So were you to come to our apartment in Manassas, we could show you all kinds of memory stones that signify these important people, important lessons, important places, important encounters in our lives. But I have a few in my office here where I'm doing the video, and I'll share them with you. So let me see if I can change the orientation on my camera. There we go. And sitting here right next to my laptop in my office are 4 of the memory stones that I keep close. And I do it because I want to remember by way of these symbols or these physical icons, these very important people or places or lessons. So starting on the left, you can see there's a picture of an elderly woman in a car. That's my mom's mom. That's Grandma Betty. And I've talked about her a couple of times in sermons. Suffice to say that Grandma Betty is really the person who I see as the pattern for my own spiritual life and my own conception of Christianity. She, in a very real way, is not just my grandmother, but she was my grandmother in the faith. And in a very real way as well, she is the pattern that I am trying to achieve in my own Christianity. That picture reminds me of that every time I see it. Next to it is a plaster statue of a shepherd with sheep. I got that statue 2 years after being ordained when I was at my first church, and it has sat on a shelf in my pastor's office or on my desk ever since. And it is a reminder of my vocation to be a shepherd to God's people and a caretaker of them. That thing, that statue, reminds me of my calling every time I see it. Sometimes when I see it, I spontaneously pray a sentence or two about my vocation as a pastor. And over the last 2.5 years, your pastor. Moving to the right, next to the shepherd, is a monk. And that actually happens to be St. Francis of Assisi. And the reason that that monk is there is that very much of my own spiritual transformation has come at the feet of historical Christian masters and figures, people like St. Francis, St. Ignatius of Loyola, St. Teresa of Avila, St. Augustine of Hippo, and more currently, people like Henry Nouwen and Thomas Merton. And for me, that reminds me of my spirituality, to devote myself to a life of prayer, to a life of study, to a life of peace and simplicity. It roots me. That is an image of what I aspire to be and the people who have influenced me greatly and really that God used to save my faith back in my 20s. And then last, there's a picture. And that picture, if you can see it or not, is of a canyon. That's where I grew up. That is a picture just north of the fish farm at the base of that canyon where I grew up in Whitewater, California. That was my first home. And in many ways, that will be always my favorite home. A place up in the high desert north of Palm Springs where I grew up among a good family and learned to love the outdoors and to find God in nature. It is my icon to remember my home, where I'm from, and how much it has shaped me. Now, hanging over my desk in my office here in the Culpeper Presbyterian offices is this. This, too, is a memory stone. This was given to me by my last church in Grand Rapids, Michigan. The name of that church was River Tree, taken from the image in the Old Testament that is so common in places like Jeremiah 17 or Psalm 1. And they gave this to me because together for 10 years, we were like a river tree. Through the good times and the bad, through the great difficulty that we first experienced when I showed up, we had sunk our roots deep down into God's waters. We had held together. We had exercised faith. And we were that river tree that did not cease to bloom. That tree hanging on the wall reminds me of those people that I love, the lessons that we learned together, and the fact that I think it was the best church experience I'm ever going to have in my life. These are a few of my memory stones. And you can tell as I talk about them that they matter a great deal to me. And on occasion, as you're supposed to do biblically with memory stones, I will let my gaze fall upon them, and then I actively remember why those memory stones matter and what they point to. And I will find myself, as I look at the picture of my grandma or at the river tree hanging on my wall, I will remember that those are the things that shape me and that have made me. And those are the things that I want to continue to make me going forward. We'll talk about another discipline, another spiritual habit this coming Sunday. I look forward to talking to you then.